You ever feel like the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as you thought? That's how it started for me. Nothing dramatic, no smoking gun. Just a gnawing feeling in the back of my mind. Julia was acting strange. Not strange like forgetting her keys or leaving dishes in the sink. It was this weird mix of being distant and overly friendly, like she was compensating for something. It wasn't until I started noticing how often Marcus came up in conversation that the little alarm bells in my head started to ring. Yeah, Marcus, my colleague. We'd worked together for years. Loud guy, always chasing attention, the kind who couldn't resist a good bet or a bad idea. I'd never liked him much, but I tolerated him because, hey, office politics. You have to play the game, right? But then Julia started talking about him like he was a regular topic of conversation. Marcus said the funniest thing today, she'd laugh. Or, Marcus really knows how to handle stressful situations. And I just nodded along, pretending I didn't notice the way she'd smile while saying his name. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. It was like he had moved into our house rent-free, and I couldn't even charge him utilities. One night, it clicked. Julia had planned a dinner date. Just us, no kids, no distractions. I was looking forward to it. But then she kept looking at her phone. She'd laugh, type something, set it down for a minute, then pick it up again like she was waiting for a reply. I couldn't help myself. Who's got you grinning like that? I asked, trying to sound casual. Oh, just Marcus, she said, her tone light, like it wasn't a big deal. He sent this meme that was so relatable. I should have let it slide, but I didn't. You're texting Marcus during date night? She looked at me like I'd grown two heads. It's not like that. We're just friends. Don't be so paranoid. Paranoid? I wasn't paranoid. At least not yet. But I knew Marcus. He wasn't just friendly. He was reckless. The guy gambled like it was a full-time job, always chasing some thrill, never caring about the fallout. And now he was texting my wife during dinner? Something didn't add up. I didn't say anything else that night. I didn't argue or press the issue. Instead, I waited. I knew Marcus. If there was something going on, he'd slip up eventually. Guys like him always do. Julia was always someone who chased thrills. When we first got together, it was one of the things I loved about her. She had this wild energy that made everything feel exciting. A trip to the grocery store could turn into an adventure. A quiet evening could transform into an all-night escapade. But as the years went by, that hunger of hers didn't fade. It grew. And me? I guess I stopped keeping up. I didn't realize how deep her restlessness ran until she started dropping little hints here and there, like pebbles tossed into a calm lake. Don't you ever feel like life's too predictable? She'd ask, spinning her wine glass at the dinner table, her eyes scanning me for a reaction. I'd shrug, half distracted. Predictable can be good. It means things are steady. Steady, she repeated, her voice flat, like I'd said a dirty word. Is that what we are? Steady? At first, I thought she was just trying to spark conversation, but it wasn't long before her words turned into actions. She started pushing boundaries, testing me in ways I wasn't prepared for. One night, she came home late, wearing this little black dress I didn't remember her owning. The neckline plunged just a little too far, and the hem barely grazed the tops of her thighs. Where've you been? I asked, trying to sound casual. Out, she said, kicking off her heels and tossing her purse onto the couch. She didn't elaborate, and when I pressed her, she gave me that sharp look that warned me not to ask again. Julia began changing, bit by bit, like a puzzle rearranging itself into a picture I didn't recognize. She'd bring up ideas, things she wanted to try, and not the kind of things you'd talk about over dinner. Wouldn't it be exciting, she mused one evening, to do something different? Something risky? Risky how? I asked, setting down my fork. Her lips curled into a sly smile. I don't know. Like, outdoors. Or somewhere public. I nearly choked on my drink. Are you serious? Why not? She said, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Don't you ever want to feel alive? Her eyes glinted with mischief, and I realized she wasn't kidding. But me? I wasn't wired that way. I liked order, control, and the idea of feeling alive the way Julia described just didn't appeal to me. I tried to brush it off, laughing nervously and saying, "I'll pass. Thanks." She didn't laugh with me. It didn't stop there. She began testing my limits in more extreme ways, showing up at home with new outfits that left little to the imagination, suggesting things that made my ears burn. "Come on," she'd say, leaning against the counter, her voice dripping with playful defiance. "What's the harm in trying something new?" I'd stammer out excuses, always finding reasons to avoid whatever wild idea she'd cooked up next. "I've got work in the morning," or "I don't think that's really my thing." She'd roll her eyes, muttering under her breath as she walked away. The tension between us grew, like a rubber band stretched too far. I started noticing the little changes in her behavior. Late-night texts she'd hide when I walked into the room, her phone glued to her hand at all hours. And Marcus's name kept popping up. "Marcus told me about this great restaurant downtown," she'd say casually. Or, "Marcus said we should check out this new trail at the park." At first, I told myself it was nothing. They worked together, after all. Well, I worked with him, technically, but they'd gotten close over the years. Too close, as it turned out. One evening, I came home early and found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She was biting her lip, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile playing on her face. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood there, watching her for a moment, trying to piece together what was going on. "What's so funny?" I asked, startling her. She jumped, clutching the phone to her chest like it was a lifeline. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, her voice higher than usual. "Just a silly meme Marcus sent me." "Marcus," I repeated, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "He's been texting you a lot lately, hasn't he?" She shrugged, trying to seem nonchalant. "We're just friends." "Don't be ridiculous." Ridiculous? Maybe. But something didn't sit right. I knew Marcus. The man was a gambler in every sense of the word: money, women, even his reputation. He lived for danger, thrived on chaos. And Julia? She was drawn to that like a moth to a flame. I didn't push her that night. I didn't yell or accuse or demand answers. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting the pieces fall into place. If Julia wanted danger, and Marcus wanted to be her escape, they were about to find out that I wasn't as clueless as they thought. Julia's appetite for adventure was becoming impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the little hints she dropped anymore. She was outright suggesting things that left me reeling. She wanted to shatter the mundane, to dive headfirst into something wild, reckless, and uninhibited. "Let's try something new tonight," she said one evening, her voice sultry as she leaned across the kitchen counter. Her dress clung to her in a way that felt deliberate, like she was daring me to say no. I glanced up from my laptop, already weary from another long day. "Like what?" She smirked, biting her lower lip in that teasing way she knew always got my attention. "I don't know. Something spontaneous. Dangerous." I chuckled nervously, unsure of where this was going. "Dangerous? Like what? Skydiving?" "No, silly," she said, stepping closer, her fingers brushing against my arm. "I mean, like in the car, or at the office after hours. Something that makes my heart race." I blinked at her, unsure if she was joking. "In the car? Julia, we're not teenagers sneaking around in high school." "That's the point," she said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "It's the thrill of it. The risk. Don't you want to feel alive?" I stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about a moment of excitement. Julia was desperate to break free from the routine, to recapture something she felt was slipping away. Her suggestions only grew bolder in the weeks that followed. One night, she came home with a blindfold and a silk rope, tossing them onto the bed with a playful grin. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "An invitation," she said, her voice dripping with suggestion. "Don't you ever wonder what it would feel like to completely let go? To give in to the moment?" I laughed, trying to play it off. "Julia, I think you've been watching too many movies." Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of frustration. "You don't even want to try, do you?" she said, crossing her arms. "You're so stuck in your comfort zone. You can't see how boring things have become." "Boring?" I said, the word stinging more than I wanted to admit. I didn't realize keeping a roof over our heads was boring. She sighed, shaking her head. That's not what I mean. I need more than this. More than the same routine every night. I want to feel wanted. Craved. I didn't know how to respond. In my mind, I was doing everything right, working hard, being a dependable partner, keeping our lives stable. But for Julia, that wasn't enough. She wanted fireworks, not just in the bedroom, but everywhere. Her ideas became more audacious. What about in the park? She suggested one day, her eyes gleaming with mischief. The park? I asked, incredulous. Julia, are you insane? There are people around. That's the point, she said, her voice low and daring. It's the risk, the possibility of getting caught. Doesn't that make your blood race? Honestly? No, I said, shaking my head. She laughed, but there was a hint of disappointment behind it. You're hopeless, she said, though her tone was more sad than teasing. But it didn't stop there. She started pushing boundaries at home, too. One evening, while I was taking a shower, she slipped into the bathroom and whispered through the steam, "What if we didn't wait?" Didn't wait for what? I asked, peeking out from behind the curtain. For privacy, she said, her eyes glinting with wicked amusement. The kids are asleep. No one will know. I laughed nervously, grabbing a towel. Julia, come on. Can't we just be normal? Normal is boring, she said, her smile fading. You're missing the point, and that was the problem. I was missing the point, her point. Julia wasn't just asking for excitement. She was screaming for it. And when I didn't give her what she wanted, she started looking for it elsewhere. I didn't know it at the time, but while I was brushing off her wild ideas and playing it safe, Marcus was stepping into the role I refused to play. He wasn't just offering her excitement. He was offering her the chaos she craved. And soon, that chaos would consume us all. When I walked through the door that night, I was already on edge. Marcus had been a nightmare at work, making sure I couldn't get a single win. Every meeting, every project, he was there, louder, faster, more daring. Management was eating it up, and every little smirk he threw my way made it clear he was enjoying himself. It felt personal, like he wasn't just gunning for my position but for me. I was tired, frustrated, and ready to collapse into bed. But the second I stepped into the house, I froze. Julia was in the kitchen, standing by the counter, and something about the scene stopped me in my tracks. Her hair was a mess, wild and tangled, like she'd been in the middle of something intense. Her cheeks were flushed, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on her skin. Then I saw her lips. They were glistening, smeared with something white that dripped slowly down the corner of her mouth. Before I could say a word, a single drop fell from her chin to the floor. The sound of it hitting the tile seemed deafening in the silent room. Julia, I said, my voice low and sharp. Her head snapped up, and her eyes went wide. For a split second, she looked like she'd been caught red-handed. Then, as if trying to cover up the panic, she gave me a wide, almost too bright smile. You're home, she said, her voice too cheerful. What is that? I asked, staring at her lips. She blinked, then raised her hand quickly, grabbing the hem of the oversized shirt she liked to wear around the house. My shirt, and wiping her mouth in one quick motion. The smear disappeared, but the image was burned into my brain. It's nothing, she said, her voice tight, forced. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing as I took her in. Her hair, her flushed skin, the way she was standing slightly turned, like she was trying to shield something from view. That's when I noticed it. A faint, glistening trail was running down her leg, disappearing into the edge of her shirt. What the hell is going on here? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She let out a nervous laugh, taking a step back. You're imagining things, she said quickly. Am I? I shot back, pointing to the floor where the small white drop still lingered. What's that, Julia? She glanced down, her smile faltering. Then she reached for the dish towel, quickly wiping it away as though that would erase what I'd just seen. It's yogurt, she said. Her words rushed, almost tripping over themselves. I was eating yogurt. I stared at her, the anger boiling under my skin. Yogurt, I repeated flatly. Yes, she said, nodding too enthusiastically. You know how clumsy I am. I must have spilled some. Then why does it smell like? I cut myself off, shaking my head as the realization began to sink in. She was still smiling, but it was forced now, the corners of her mouth twitching like she was barely holding it together. The faint scent in the air, the way she wiped her mouth so quickly, the trail running down her leg. It all painted a picture I didn't want to see. Where is he? I demanded, my voice low. Dangerous. Who? She asked, her smile fading into something more defensive. Don't play dumb with me, Julia, I said, my heart pounding. Where is he? There's no one here, she snapped, crossing her arms. I stormed through the house, throwing open doors and checking every room. The living room was empty, the guest bathroom spotless, and the bedroom looked untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was too late. Whoever had been here was gone. When I returned to the kitchen, Julia was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. You're being ridiculous, she said, glaring at me. You're tired. Go to bed. But I couldn't. The smell lingered, faint but unmistakable, and the image of her standing there with that white smear on her lips haunted me. Marcus wasn't just winning at work. He was winning at home, too. And I wasn't about to let him take everything without a fight. The house was quiet when I walked in that night. Too quiet. Julia was sitting on the couch, her legs curled underneath her, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but the second she looked up at me, I knew something was off. Hey, you, she said, her voice overly sweet, like she'd been rehearsing it. She stood up, smoothing her shirt down, but her movements were quick, almost jittery. You're late. Yeah. Work ran over, I muttered, kicking off my shoes. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. Before I could make it to the kitchen, she was in front of me. Her hands grabbed my belt buckle, and I froze, caught off guard. Julia, what are you? Shoo, she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a wild glint I didn't recognize. Her hands slid lower, and then she grabbed me. Bold, aggressive, and completely unlike her usual self. Seriously, I said, trying to step back, but she held me in place, her grip firm. Don't act like you don't like it, she purred, her voice dripping with something that wasn't playful. It was mocking. Then, before I could react, she tilted her head back and let a thick white liquid trickle down her face, smearing it across her cheeks and lips. What the hell, Julia? I barked, pulling away. She laughed. A sharp, biting sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Relax, it's just yogurt, she said, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. I'm on this new diet, you know. Yogurt's great for weight loss. I stared at her, my jaw tight. That's not funny. Come on, she said, stepping closer. Don't be so serious all the time. She leaned in and pressed her lips to mine, forceful and uninvited. The sour tang of whatever she'd smeared on her face made me pull back instantly, wiping my mouth with my sleeve. Cut it out, Julia, I snapped. Her laughter died off, replaced by a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. You're no fun anymore, she said, crossing her arms. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked toward the bedroom, leaving her standing there. Once the door was closed behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands. This wasn't Julia, not the woman I'd married. The change in her behavior wasn't just unsettling. It was driving me insane. The aggressive flirting, the bizarre stunts, the way she always seemed like she was playing a game I didn't understand. It all felt calculated. And then there was Marcus. I didn't have proof, but I wasn't stupid. The way she spoke about him, the way she lit up when his name came up, the way she seemed to be testing me every time I walked through the door, it all pointed to one thing. I needed answers. The next day, I made the call. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet, someone who wouldn't let a single detail slip through the cracks. I need to know if something's going on, I told him, my voice low as I explained the situation. I need the truth. He assured me he'd get to work immediately, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control returning to my life. Whatever was happening between Julia and Marcus, I wasn't going to let it destroy me. Not without a fight. The detective I hired was the quiet, no-nonsense type. He didn't waste words or offer false reassurances. "Give me a week," he said after I laid out the situation. "I'll find out what you need to know." I spent the next few days on edge, feeling like I was holding my breath underwater. At work, Marcus's presence became unbearable. His smug confidence, the way he leaned back in his chair during meetings as if he already owned the place. It was a constant reminder of what might be happening behind my back. On Friday afternoon, the detective called. "We need to meet," he said, his tone clipped. When we sat down at a small diner later that evening, he laid out everything he'd uncovered. And it was worse than I'd imagined. "Marcus has a history," the detective began, sliding a folder across the table. "Gambling debts, fraud, and a string of affairs. He's been living on the edge for years, hopping from one scheme to the next. He's good at what he does. Manipulating people, creating chaos, getting what he wants." He pulled out a photo, grainy but clear enough to recognize. It was Marcus, stepping out of a car in front of my house. "I followed him a few nights ago," the detective said. "He's been there when you're not. He's careful, though. Only stays for short periods, and he's always gone before you get home." My stomach twisted as he flipped to the next photo. This one showed Marcus in my living room, his tie undone around his neck, holding a drink in one hand and smirking at someone just out of frame. "He's bold," the detective continued. "Either he thinks you won't find out or he wants you to." That night, as I sat alone in the house, my mind raced. I went through every drawer, every corner of the apartment, desperate to confirm what the photos had already told me. And then, in the back of the laundry room, I found it. Marcus's tie, crumpled and forgotten, reeking of his cologne. I clutched it in my hand, fury and disgust boiling over. He'd been here in my home while I was at work, with her. The next morning, Julia was back to her usual erratic behavior, playing the role of a carefree wife who had nothing to hide. She was standing at the kitchen counter when I walked in, unpacking groceries. Among the usual items, milk, bread, fruit, was a large tub of yogurt. "What's that for?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced at me with a coy smile. "It's for me," she said, her tone light and playful. "A little indulgence." I watched as she took the tub and disappeared into the bedroom, her laughter trailing behind her. When I followed a few minutes later, I found her sprawled on the bed, her shirt pushed up, the yogurt tub open beside her. She dipped her fingers into the creamy mess, then smeared it over her skin with slow, deliberate movements. "Julia," I said, my voice tight, "what the hell are you doing?" She looked up, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "It's dessert," she said, her tone teasing. "Want a taste?" I stared at her, a mix of anger and disbelief surging through me. She didn't wait for my answer. Instead, she spread the yogurt lower, her smile daring me to react. "Isn't this what you wanted?" she asked, her voice low, taunting. I turned and walked out of the room, her laughter ringing in my ears. Whatever game she and Marcus thought they were playing, it wasn't going to end the way they expected. The evidence was piling up, and soon, they'd both realize that I wasn't the fool they took me for. At work, Marcus's campaign against me had reached its peak. The tender that was supposed to solidify my position, my work, my expertise, had been stolen out from under me. His fingerprints were all over it, yet he'd been careful to cover his tracks just enough to make it look like my failure. I sat in that boardroom watching him bask in the praise from management, the smirks, the backpats. His arrogance was unshakable, his confidence a dagger aimed squarely at me. "Great job, Marcus," the director said, shaking his hand. "This kind of initiative is exactly what we need." Marcus gave a modest chuckle, but his eyes found mine across the table. The smirk he gave me said everything. He knew I couldn't prove what he'd done, and he was reveling in it. My reputation was in shambles. Whispers had started circulating among colleagues, questions about whether I could keep up, whether I was slipping. Marcus had stolen not just my work but the foundation of everything I'd built in the company. When the meeting ended, He leaned over as I was gathering my things and muttered, "Tough break, buddy. Better luck next time." I clenched my fists but said nothing. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me snap. Not yet. By the time I got home, I was already seething. My mind was a blur of anger and frustration as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was silent, unnervingly so. "Julia?" I called out, setting my bag down on the counter. There was no response, just an oppressive quiet that made my stomach twist. I walked into the living room, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. Her hair was a tangled mess, matted with streaks of something white. Her face was smeared with it, two thick, glistening streaks that clung to her cheeks and lips, some of it dripping onto her shirt. For a moment, I just stared, frozen in place as the scene before me registered. The air smelled faintly of sweat and something else, something that made my stomach churn. "Julia," I said, my voice sharp. "What the hell happened here?" She didn't look up at first, just let out a choked sob as her shoulders trembled. I stepped closer, my eyes narrowing at the trail of white droplets leading across the floor toward the coffee table. "Julia," I repeated, louder this time. She finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen, tears streaming down her cheeks and mixing with the mess on her face. He left me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew. "Marcus," she choked out, her voice barely audible. My jaw tightened as I crouched down in front of her. "What did he do?" I asked, my voice low and controlled. Her lip quivered as she hesitated. He came over," she stammered, her hands shaking. "And we were together. Afterward, her voice broke off, and she covered her face with her hands. "Go on," I said, the fury rising in my chest. "He finished," she whispered, her voice trembling. "On my face, my hair, everywhere." I clenched my fists, my stomach churning as she continued. "And then he laughed," she cried. "He said I was a stupid, pathetic girl, that I wasn't good enough for him." Her sobs grew louder as she buried her face in her hands. "He said I'd be out on the street soon," she choked out. "That no one would ever want me." I stood, towering over her as she crumpled further into herself. The humiliation, the betrayal. It was all there, written across her tear-streaked face. At work, Marcus had stolen my reputation. At home, he had humiliated my wife and defiled my trust. But his arrogance, his cruelty, it was going to be his downfall. This wasn't over. The detective didn't disappoint. A week after I hired him, he called me to his office with a tone that said he'd found more than enough. When I arrived, he handed me a thick folder, its weight feeling both heavy and liberating in my hands. "You're not going to like what you see," he warned as he sat across from me. "I'm already living it," I replied grimly, opening the folder. Inside were photographs, time-stamped records, and even video stills from surveillance cameras. Marcus and Julia were together in places I didn't even know they'd been. The park near our neighborhood, a hotel just outside town, even the back seat of my own car, parked in the lot of a shopping center. My hands shook as I flipped through the images. There were videos, too grainy but damning. Marcus and Julia, locked in compromising positions, their faces clear, their betrayal etched into every frame. The detective didn't need to narrate. The evidence spoke for itself. But the file didn't stop there. "This," the detective said, tapping a second folder, "is where Marcus really screwed himself." Inside were records of his debts, stretching back years. Marcus had borrowed heavily from gambling sharks, financial institutions, and even personal acquaintances. He had defaulted on most of them, leaving a trail of ruined relationships and unpaid balances. But the worst of it came from his work history. "He's done this before," the detective explained. "Marcus has a habit of sabotaging colleagues, taking credit for their work, and then jumping ship before the fallout hits. He's left at least 2 companies in shambles after botched projects he pitched but couldn't deliver on. The names of the companies were there, along with copies of emails and court documents. One company had filed a lawsuit against Marcus, but it had been quietly settled out of court. The other had folded entirely after he left, unable to recover from the damage he'd caused. "This guy's a walking time bomb," the detective said, leaning back in his chair. "He burns everything he touches, and you're just his latest target." I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the folder. "Not for long," I muttered. That night, I stayed up late, making copies of everything. One set went to a prosecutor I'd known for years, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for taking down corporate fraudsters. I didn't need to explain much. The evidence spoke for itself. She promised to investigate, her sharp eyes lighting up at the prospect of exposing Marcus's web of lies. The second set was for Marcus's current employer, my company. I typed up an anonymous email and attached the documents, including the surveillance footage and records of his past misconduct. I kept the message short and to the point, to whom it may concern. The attached documents detail the fraudulent and unethical actions of your employee, Marcus Johnson. You may wish to review this evidence before further harm is done to your organization. I sent the email late at night, knowing it would hit the director's inbox first thing in the morning. Then I sat back, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. Marcus had played his game well, but he'd underestimated me. The pieces were finally falling into place, and this time he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The clock was ticking, and Marcus's empire of lies was about to crumble. The fallout started early the next morning. By the time I arrived at work, the office was buzzing. People huddled in clusters, whispering and shooting glances toward Marcus Johnson's desk. I kept my head down and listened. "Did you see the email?" One coworker whispered to another. "Unbelievable," the other replied, her eyes wide. "How did he even get away with it for this long?" I made my way to my desk, acting like I didn't know a thing. Marcus's desk was conspicuously empty, his chair pushed back awkwardly as though he'd left in a hurry. An hour later, the director walked out of his office, his expression thunderous. "Staff meeting," he barked. "Conference room. Now." We all filed in, the tension thick enough to choke on. Marcus Johnson was already there, seated at the far end of the table with a forced smile plastered across his face. He looked calm, but I could see the strain in his clenched jaw, the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. The director wasted no time. "Last night, I received some very concerning information regarding one of our employees," he began, his voice cold. "Mr. Marcus Johnson, would you care to explain these documents?" He slapped a folder onto the table, its contents spilling out. Copies of the very same evidence I'd sent. Emails, financial records, surveillance footage. Everything. Marcus's face went pale, but he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "I don't know what this is," he said smoothly. "Someone must be trying to frame me." The director wasn't buying it. "The evidence is damning, Marcus," he said, his voice sharp. "Fraud, misconduct, sabotage. Do you deny that you've engaged in these actions here and at your previous places of employment?" Marcus hesitated, his confidence faltering for the first time. I don't know where this is coming from. It's absurd." "It's not absurd," the director interrupted. "It's criminal. Security will escort you out while we conduct a full investigation. If these allegations are true, you'll be hearing from the authorities." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a mistake," he snapped, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. Two security guards stepped forward, and Marcus had no choice but to follow them. As he passed by me, his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I saw the rage, the realization that I had been the one to outmaneuver him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared back, letting him know that he had lost. The office erupted into whispers as soon as he was gone. People speculated, piecing together the bits of information they'd gleaned from the meeting. But I stayed quiet. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the prosecutor. "It's airtight," she said, her tone confident. "With this evidence, we can take him down for good." That evening, when I returned home, Julia was still there. She'd barely left the couch in days, her once vibrant energy reduced to nothing. When she saw me, she sat up, her eyes searching mine. "What's going to happen to him?" she asked softly. "Justice," I replied simply, taking off my coat. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "You can't," I said bluntly. "Some things can't be fixed." I spent the next few weeks tying up loose ends. Marcus Johnson was arrested, his crimes laid bare for everyone to see. The company cleared my name and reinstated my reputation. And Julia? She packed her things and moved out. It wasn't easy, but there was peace in the aftermath. I sold the house, moved out to a small ranch I'd inherited from my parents, and started over. For the first time in years, I felt free.